FYI, it's Bird Week this week.
Like, legitimately Bird Week, or if you just named it Bird Week?
No, legitimately, like, civilian scientists galore are going to be looking to the skies, counting birds.
Awesome. Hello and welcome to Literary Canon Ball, a podcast for anyone who wants a fun and feisty conversation about books. Literary Canon Ball is inspired by the work of the Stell Account and the Vita Survey, which reveal the ongoing gender imbalance in the conversations around books. Literary Canon Ball is striving to correct some of that imbalance by reading and talking about books written by women from around the world. I am Kirby Fenwick and I'm joined by Neve.
Student by day, writer, editor by night, and reader by nature.
You're getting so good at that, it's so impressive.
Rolling.
And Fee.
Fee Murphy. I realised in all the other podcasts I just say Fee. I'm like, I do have two names. I'm not Madonna.
And how are we feeling today?
Okay.
Good?
I feel good. Caffeinated.
Excellent. Let's just
That's
jump.
probably a worry.
Let's jump straight into book chats. So to our book for episode 6. What would the world look like if women had had access to and been welcome into the scientific realm from the beginning? The mind boggles. This is not a question Australian scientist and science journalist Margaret Wertheim really attempts to answer in Pythagoras Trousers, God, Physics and the Gender Wars, but it is a question you'll be left with after reading. Published in 1997, Pythagoras Trousers is a cultural and social history of physics from ancient Greece to the Renaissance to now, or at least now 20 years ago, that does attempt to forge links between physics and religion and the barriers this link served up to women. Sophie, you suggested that we chat about this book. Why?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. And I stand by those reasons because I know we've been like messaging each other throughout going, bit of a challenging read. This book was mentioned on a really fun podcast that I listened to called Chat 10 Looks 3 with Lee Sales and Annabelle Crabb. And Annabelle Crabb was mentioning how she really enjoyed reading this book because the author, Margaret Wertheim, she's really into crochet. And she's like,
yes, she is
crocheting like the Great Barrier Reef.
She's crocheting the Great Barrier Reef, yeah.
And just like such a gun with the needles.
Actually, it's a hook. It's a hook.
With a hook. Hook by crook. Crook by hook. And they were just talking about crocheting, what this incredible scientist she is and how women in science are like unearthing ways of representing complex mathematical theorems and equations via crochet, and how it's like
I love that so much.
Rejuvenating the field and how it's like creating all these scientific breakthroughs. And they mentioned that she wrote this best-selling book in the 90s, Pythagoras Trousers, and how it was the first really in-depth look at the position of female scientists across the kind of the span of science in general and how they've been systematically shut out of the field. And I just thought that would be a really juicy thing to talk about, and I'm kind of really glad that we are talking about it. I know it's a little bit dry in sections, but what did you guys think of the book?
I actually really enjoyed it. I know I was giving it a little bit of shit, but that was more because I was annoyed with myself because I had to skim read like the last 50 or so pages. Because I didn't
just finished reading the book.
Yeah,
today.
I'm not even gonna make excuses. Just who I am as a person.
You're a great person. You're a great person.
You have things going on.
I think though, with me, the classics, I really loved the beginning sections. I got really into it, and I was like, yeah, cool. It lost me a little bit towards the like middle endish bit where it sort of goes really deep into sort of the maths side of physics. And I'm sort of like, I'm really trying hard to keep up with this. But as she was sort of writing about the maths, I was sort of like, yeah, okay. But then as she went back into sort of religion and gender, it pulled me back in. That was how I was sort of...
Yeah, I get that. I guess I kind of feel the same way. Like some of that really like theory sort of dense stuff was a little bit alienating because I was like, I have no idea what she's talking about. But, you know, when she was talking about people and about these experiences, particularly of women in science, and, you know, how really so much of the early scientific developments were really influenced and encouraged by and likely financed by the church.
Yeah.
I found that really interesting. I think that's a really interesting connection that perhaps a lot of lay people might not know. But yeah, a lot of that really physics heavy stuff was a little bit tough to get through, but the people, I was really, really into the people, and I actually have like 2 pages of names of women scientists that I wrote down as I was reading this book, and I'm really interested to go and learn more about them and their stories.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's something that I felt was kind of missing. I wanted more about the women.
That was one thing that I found really interesting with the structure of it, because I picked it up thinking it was going to be more in depth about women in science and specific women.
Yeah.
But then when you actually read the book, a lot of it is like how science was founded, and there was just so few women allowed into it that it's really a story about men creating science and what science looks like. That for long sections of it, I was like, not a single woman's been mentioned. This doesn't feel like a classic feminist text in the essence that she takes quite an interesting historical look at it. And then rather than placing the lens of feminism and judgment on it, she kind of lays out the facts, and then I put my feminist lens to it rather than creating this really like, well, this should be this and that could be that. She doesn't kind of make conclusions or assumptions until the end, where she's like, well, now that we know all of this, we can't change how we've created things in the past and thought about things in the past, but moving forward, what are the possibilities and potentials for the future of science? So I found that quite easy to engage with, in the essence that she wasn't quite dogmatic and beating down on the past, but she was more just kind of objectively saying this was this and this was that. So it didn't feel like wading through sort of a really actually a sad history of female oppression, because I feel like it could have taken that tone quite easily, because it's quite horrific how women have been treated by
some of them were murdered.
Well, 1 million women were executed for being witches.
Yeah.
That number, I stopped and I was like, that is fucking huge. And often the witch hunts aren't talked about in the scale.
Absolutely not.
Oh, yeah.
People have this idea of like Salem.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and there was like
one
5
off
women.
town.
There was like 5 women, and that was it. And it's like, no. And that line made me so angry, and I have to say, and I did mention this to you guys earlier, as I was reading this book, there was so many moments when I was so angry. I was furious about just the way women had been excluded and the way they'd been treated. You know, I mean, there were stories of remarkable, incredible, genius women who worked for decades for these scientific institutions and universities without pay.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to throw the book across the room. I was so furious. All this, you know, we talk about like the unpaid labor of women and how the world basically would not exist were it not for the unpaid labor of women.
Yeah.
Let's be honest.
Oh.
And I just found that so infuriating, those stories of these women who...
I agree. Like, I found I was infuriated by this, but I found it amazing how Wertheim could write about it in a way that was clear, concise, compelling, but it wasn't, I didn't feel her specific anger through the book, which I kind of find interesting, because maybe she was kind of applying almost a scientific lens to the history of science.
Yeah.
So it was quite compelling storytelling, but it didn't have this rage to it where it was excluding me as a reader. It was more like I was given space to feel this anger, where I was like, how can we win? How can we... Not it's about winning, it's just asking for
how can we
equality.
participate?
Absolutely. And she makes that very clear, that there are women over the hundreds of years actively trying to participate in science and actively trying to engage in it, but still being... There are ways of shutting women out of the field.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I think where this book gains a lot of complexity and it was how, like, the middle bit, which was the God and the religion, and how that affected how women entered the scientific sphere or didn't. And how, like, I think it was really interesting how she sort of kept coming back to the point where it was science has always been affected by culture. It's not a purely objective pursuit.
Oh, of no way.
And how it's always that's always fed into each other. Because I think that's sort of a real myth about science and how people view science, because they think, okay, well, it's science and facts and maths and whatever. Therefore, you know, it's truth. And that's how it's a very masculine sort of objective ideal, whereas like the reality is that those facts and those figures have always had to be interpreted
by people,
you know, and
who are not objective.
Exactly. And there have always been instances where they've taken the facts and thought about them in a way that has sort of complemented the dogma of the time. And it's really, like, it goes into sort of Newton and how, like, how he sort of worked with his own faith to sort of engage science with the church, or as opposed to sort of Galileo, who was like, fuck you. And
yeah, that was really interesting, you know, that idea that some of the theories or ideas that various predominantly men put up were sort of pushed back by the church, saying, no, we can't have that. You know, like, oh, no.
No.
And so they had to work, like, these scientists had to work within these boundaries.
Oh, and
in many respects.
Beautiful, beautiful irony of the fact that mechanism came from, like, a scientist wanting to try and work around the church, and so that it could, like, mechanism having that ideal set, so it can leave room for supernatural events, as opposed to how it's viewed now as is, like, you know, a completely atheist, like, really sort of hardcore, like, scientific dogma. It's really funny.
Well, there's something she says in the book too, which I thought was really interesting. Towards the end, when she says that for so long, because I know this book focuses on physics and we're sort of expanding it out to science, but for so long, because you know, science / physics has had that sort of ethical and moral framework of the church, and now there's that distinction between science and religion. Science no longer has that inbuilt ethical and moral framework, and so we need to build a secular one.
Yeah.
I found that really, really interesting, because I'd never thought much about the link between religion and science. It just had never kind of crossed my mind.
Oh, definitely. And I think that goes back again to sort of that idea of, oh yeah, well, you know, science is inherently objective, therefore it's outside of ethics. And so I think the criticism here is that, no, it needs to have an ethics like any other sort of science branch. I mean, what makes it special?
Absolutely.
You know?
And I think we should clarify that Wertheim does say that biology and the life sciences do have, like, a strong ethical code of conduct, mainly because of the application is in medicine and it's applied directly to people with physical outcomes, and it has to go through a board of ethics and everything has to be approved, whereas with physics, for so long it was more a philosophical concept with no actual applications until they invented electricity and all the rest of it, that science got real, and it got real quickly, but to the point where nobody knew how to frame questions. What questions should we be asking of physics? How should we apply this knowledge of physics to the realm of the world? And I find that all incredibly interesting, of who the question askers were and who was allowed into university and tertiary education. And I found that so fascinating, learning about how schooling systems were set up and things like that around the world.
Yeah.
And it shocked me, like, as you were saying, Kirby, how the church funded so many things. They funded Oxford and Cambridge to the point where those universities replicated the structures of the church.
Yeah.
And the lecturers and fellows had to be celibate. They just were essentially a priesthood of education, and the uni fellows of Oxford and Cambridge were not allowed to marry until 1882, which seems so shockingly recent. Like, a lot of this is just how, because I certainly didn't know a lot of stuff about maths and science, and I've been boring people by going, oh my God, did you know Pythagoras actually was a cult, and a secret cult at that? And they basically assigned like, kind of, it was like the horoscope of numbers. And it's just like such a romp of like, how the fuck did we get to where we are in the world from all these wacky belief systems of like Pythagoras saying you must eat this and do this and we have to do this on the full moon, and then maybe if this number means that, and it's
interesting though how she takes those philosophical through lines though, as like God is the mathematician to like Pythagoras, all the way to Stephen Hawking as, you know, sort of the theory of everything, and like, you know, seeing God as sort of, having, what is it, the eye of the God or something?
Mind.
Yeah, mind of the God, thank you. So that sort of through line and how that's ducked and weaved throughout time. Though going back to the institutions and the education, I thought it was really great how Wertheim made the effort to like go into the history of like, not just, okay, women weren't allowed into institutions, therefore women were barred, but sort of going into like, you know, France and how women were in the salons and like would interact with men there,
and the impact they had in that respect.
Yeah, exactly. And how women were taught informally by fathers and supported by husbands, and sort of going into that and how sort of they tried to get in that way, not just sort of that really essentialist view of like, okay, well, women weren't in universities, therefore, you know, obviously they were just barred entirely, or like there wasn't enough interest, or there weren't women who contributed because of that.
I think she kind of dispels that myth, doesn't she, that women weren't interested.
Yeah.
Or didn't have the aptitude.
Yeah.
Because she mentions, like I said, I've got 2 pages of names of women that I'm now going to go and pop into Google and do some research on. Like, she really dispels that myth that they weren't interested, you know, that women weren't interested or didn't have the aptitude, because they were interested.
Oh, yeah.
But they just came up against so many barriers, but so many of them were like, I don't care what barriers you put in front of me, I'm just going to keep going. And I'm kind of in awe of so many of these women that just were just like...
And the sheer endurance that they had.
Absolutely.
Because many of the women in the later period of time, say the 1800s, if they were lucky enough to have an enlightened father who taught them things, and they found someone who was kind enough to sneak them into a laboratory or something for them to act. So literal physical barriers getting through to actually then being in the institution and practicing as a scientist, having to live in poverty for decades, doing work without credit and contributing actively.
And work without credit. Oh, that burns. That burns so much. Who does she mention right at the end? I should have written this down. A woman who...
was it the Jewish woman at the end?
I've totally forgotten her name.
The woman from China?
Yes, she instigated the experiments that allowed the discovery, and she misses out on any kind of recognition for that. And that just, like, I wanted to throw the book again. I was angry again.
Yeah. Oh.
Yes.
For podcast listeners, I'm like doing like little like
punches in the air.
Yeah, flailing fists.
There was something that I wanted to read because I think it poses some really interesting questions that are worth thinking about. And I think the whole book kind of poses this interesting question. But she's talking about, is it Marie or Mary Curie? Anyway, Marie Curie. She's talking about her, and she's saying, if even a woman of Curie's genius and determination was almost defeated before she set foot inside a university lecture hall, how insurmountable are the barriers must have seemed to most aspiring female physicists. What of those countless of others Who knows what talent was squandered because women were not given equal access to education and careers? Who knows what insights and inventions were lost because more women did not participate in the great technological revolution of the 19th century? That really struck me because, there are so many stories about things like the symptoms of heart attacks being different in women.
Yeah.
There are stories about drugs not being tested on women because women's hormone levels fluctuate. It's easier to just test them on men, but then we don't know how women will respond to these drugs.
Yeah.
There's so many stories like that, how women are just sort of not taken into account. But then there's also this other, I don't know, you could imagine an entire other dimension where women were allowed in, and their experiences and their perceptions and their view of the world and who they are could contribute to the most remarkable developments in science and technology in the world. And we haven't got that because we haven't let them in.
Yeah.
Not that I haven't let them in, but as a society, women have been barred. What have we lost? What have we lost?
And I think that's the key point of using a collective we, because it was systematically barring women on a social scale because it wasn't socially acceptable. But I find it really interesting that you use the word story associated with women, because literally they were creating stories about women. And I found this so hilarious and funny, but also heartbreaking with saying women don't have the aptitude because, well, anatomically they've got smaller skulls than men, so really they've got smaller brains. But when they discovered in terms of the ratio of skull size to body mass, women actually have larger skulls than men when it's a ratio. So then they turn it around and go, oh, well, children also have larger heads in their body. So obviously women are on par with children, and they just can't think. So there was no fucking way of winning.
You couldn't win. You can't win.
Spun everything around to be like, women just can't because they can't and they shouldn't and they won't ever. And it's just so dogmatic that it's no wonder we're in the state that we are now, because we just pass these stories on from one generation to the next. So even if you think you're being objective and empirical, you're not. The bedrock of it all comes from a really horrendous place.
Oh, definitely. Because people still now will say, oh, yeah, but, men bodies, they're just different. And, obviously, all bodies are different. But then we make assumptions and we draw conclusions about that. Those assumptions and conclusions aren't always correct, not usually.
Or based in any fact whatsoever.
Exactly.
I mean, they do that study about aptitude for maths, and they tested, she mentions in this book, actually, Wertheim mentions in this book, they tested male and female students at 3 ages, and for the first 2 ages, I think it was 9 and 13, they were pretty much even.
Yeah.
In fact, in the earliest test, when they were the youngest, the girls were in front for mathematical aptitude.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until the last test, when they were 17 or something, that all of a sudden the boys sort of inched in front. But how much of that is about social conditioning? How much of that is about girls not being given the support and encouragement from their teachers and their schools, or from their family and friends? It's all very well and good to say, yes, but, by the time they're 17, boys have they score better. Sure, but they've had, a whole bunch of support and encouragement that girls haven't had.
Yeah. You know what's really disturbing, actually, is that, growing up, I was as interested in science as I was in literature and humanities. And then that shifted. I can actually tell you the exact time it shifted. It was when I was starting to learn physics.
Oh,
and
no.
that's when I
really
got disengaged.
Yeah,
so
wow.
reading this was oh, wow, this is a thing that still happens. Because I didn't leave at school that long ago.
Yeah.
Because I remember, because I went... actually, I'll share sorry, I'm just going to do a little side note, but I promise it's relevant. I went to an all-girls school, and part of, you could do this science experience over the holidays, which is, you went to Monash University, you went around all the different science departments and did some stuff. It was all good. We had this little class thing, and I can't remember the exact little thing we were meant to do, but I think it was kind of based on Pythagorean theorem, and you had little triangles, you had to make it into a square or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I was in this group, and these boys were sort of talking with each other and going, oh, this or this or this, da, 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 da. And I remember just sort of looking at it and then just doing it, and people just sort of looked at me. I'm like, oh yeah, so sorry, I'm sorry. I just and then the instructor just looked at me and she's like, stop apologizing, you're right, you just did it. The fact that my first impulse was to apologize
for being right,
yeah, it sort of shows how early we are conditioned socially, especially in terms of mathematics and science.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I said something, I posted a picture about this book on Instagram, and I said, it's not generally something I would pick up to read. And if I read about science, I'm probably going to read Elizabeth Colbert. He's my favourite science writer. Or, the best Australian science writing or something like that, those anthologies. I'm probably not going to pick up a book like this, but perhaps, and this is what I said on Instagram, is I think maybe we need to know, how do we change things or make things better or create space for women to participate if we don't know what got us here, if we don't know the history, if we don't know what has taken place. Do we not need to know before we can make any change?
I agree. And I think what's really makes my heart really warm about this book is the fact that that's what she realized when she was writing the book, because originally this book was going to be an explanation, kind of like a beginner's intro to what physics is, a really easy way to explain physics, because she loves physics, went to uni for 5 or 6 years studying it, and she pretty much finished that manuscript, but she just didn't feel comfortable with it. There was something about it. She was like, hold on, but where are the women in this story? And then that's when she thought, I'm going to put that aside, rewrite it all, and figure out what this is, because she knew there was some religious implications, and it was only when she started doing a deep dive into finding out what that is. And from reading it, it sounds like there's a tremendous amount of research that she's done, and
massive.
The amount of stuff that she would have had to work to uncover, because so many women are not recorded in history, that would have just been an epic hunt to just figure out who existed and when. And but it's such I think this is an important book, exactly what you're saying, Kirby. To understand the science, we need to understand where it comes from, and it comes from a philosophical basis, because for hundreds of years, there was no application of physics. There was no literal application of it. It didn't solve any problems. It didn't produce any goods or services. It was just a thought process. And those thoughts were guided by particular institutions and structures. And she really explains that really quite nicely in the introduction, where a lot of people get afraid and put off by physics because they struggle to understand the answers of physics. And she's like, hold on. To understand the answers, you have to understand the questions we're asking, what the point of the questions are. And I was stopped and I thought, oh my God, I never actually stopped and thought, well, what are the questions of physics? What are they actually trying to do? What are these theorems giving us the answers to? I don't even know the questions. And I think she does a tremendous job in quite a short space, in terms of a short word count, of kind of giving me an interest and a curiosity to what those questions are and how they're applied. And the future of science moving forward, where could it go next, is anyone's guess. But
this book is 20 years old. It's published in 1997. Do we think much has changed? It still feels quite relevant to me.
Yeah.
Even though it's 20 years old.
Do some sneaky stats now if you wanted to, but I don't feel like it would have changed tremendously. I think you're right. I think the barriers are perhaps the barriers are crumbling a little bit, but they're still there. Well, there's still recently there's been all that stuff about women in STEM and not so much physics, but in technology and the barriers they have to face there. So I don't feel like this...
And I would be quite comfortable making the assertion that those barriers exist everywhere.
Oh, well, the barriers. So I wrote an article recently looking into maths anxiety in women, and the barriers are still there to the point where the Office of the Australian Scientist, so the Australian government has the chief scientist, kind of an office where they kind of put out reports and things of science. They literally had to release a press statement a year ago saying, girls aren't as bad at maths as boys. This is not true. And it's like an actual document going through each myth that is associated with girls not being able, are innately not good at maths. And if the government, the chief scientist of Australia, literally has to put a press release out going, stop this nonsense because we're damaging society by perpetuating myths.
We've got problems still.
These myths are active in our society, and we need to stop just saying men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Like, we just think differently.
We know how you feel about that book.
I honestly feel like, you know what, get the matches out.
So this book is still relevant. I think it's still relevant, and it's still a worthwhile read, and I would recommend it.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yay! I know, and I felt, honestly, I really did struggle at the start of this book. I was like, oh, Fee, why? But having read it and, you know, and had this conversation, I would recommend it.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'd recommend it as well.
Fee's wrapped.
That's so wrapped.
There's just such a rapture on your face. I have a real soft spot for any sort of project or any book that tries to knock down the elitism around a certain subject, and this is what it tries to do. Even though, like, I mean, I found it sometimes a little bit difficult in terms of, like, when it gets really, really technical, but also at the same time, I wanted to engage in it.
Yeah.
Like, I felt the spark
Yeah.
of trying to, like, I was wanting to try and sort of understand what's going on, and then, like, how that linked into the culture and then the gender.
Yeah.
So I think she does a really good job of that. I think it's pretty readable considering the content.
I have to agree. I do think it's pretty readable. And, you know, like, as I said, I read Elizabeth Colbert and the best Australian science writing. So I'm pushing this up against quite very accessible science writing. But there were only a few moments in this book where it felt really inaccessible. But like you said, you push through, you just keep reading.
Yeah.
And it's, you get to those really great bits.
Exactly.
And there's lots of really great bits.
Oh my
So
goodness,
I
that
recommend
guy
it.
who's like, oh, Newton was such a legend. Let's get rid of Jesus Christ and make, like, Newton our new savior. The birth of our
Lord
Christ.
and Savior Newton.
Yeah.
And did they say that they would start time again from the year he was born?
1638 or something like that. I was like, wow, everybody loves this, like, retiring farmer folk guy.
So that's three thumbs up for Pythagoras' Trousers. God, physics and the gender wars.
2 for me. So
that's 4.
4 thumbs.
That's pretty. That's a nice.
That's
That's
some
nice
good
for
maths.
Margaret. Okay, so 2 recommendations for episode 6. What have we been reading and watching and listening to that we want to share? Neve, what you got?
Okay, so I have 2 things. My first recommendation is called Hold Me, and it's by Courtney Milan. It is a romance.
Ooh.
Because I actually, full disclosure to podcast listeners, I actually read a lot of romance, but I don't recommend a lot of romance because of a lot of reasons.
specific types of romance.
It's one of the most popular genres in the entire world.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I tend to go for a lot of, like, I like historical. I like contemporary. I don't know. I especially like romance that has LGBT themes, like this one.
Yeah.
Yay!
Okay, tell us about it.
Okay, so basically, this is the second in a series. The first one is called Trade Me. It's also quite good. But I really liked this one. Basically, the premise is that these two characters, Jay and Maria, have been sort of messaging each other because Maria has this sort of anonymous apocalypse blog. Where she sort of...
Like, is she a prepper?
No, she's not like a prepper, but she's basically like done some science in her degree, and she's like trained to become an actuary, so she's quite mathematically inclined. So she sort of goes through like how apocalypse scenarios could happen.
So she's basically Nostradamus.
No, well, like the point of like the structure of the blog is that like she's pretending to be someone from the future, telling people from the past, this is how all these apocalypses are going to happen, and here's how you need to stop it.
Do you get to read any of the blog in the book? Because I really want to read the blog now.
We read about the blog. I don't think we read anything of the blog, which actually I kind of like because sometimes that probably might have bogged it down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
What I really liked is that it has a kind of you've got mail.
I love that movie. I love that movie
because they've messaged to each other for like about 2 years, but then when they meet in real life,
2 years.
Yeah, when they meet in real life, they don't realize it's them because they meet through mutual connections. And I'm just going to be straight up. Jay at the beginning of this book is a dick. Like, he's a bit of a dick. This is actually so weirdly connected to what we've been talking about because he's a scientist. I think he actually does some stuff with physics. And he's one of those like guys who sort of is like, oh yeah, I'm a feminist because I do X, Y, Z. But then because Maria is quite feminine, he makes assumptions about her. And then so they have quite apathetic and really like, they really hate each other at the beginning.
Yeah, right.
And so then the story unfolds and it's really gorgeous. Part of it, what I really loved is that with Courtney Milan and all her books, you get a lot of her character's internal sort of like struggle, and it's always about them sort of having to reconcile the trauma of their past and sort of recognize how their past is affecting how their actions now. Also, part of the book where I think was quite well handled is that Marie is trans, and how that was incorporated into the book I thought was really well done. Both characters are characters of colour. Like, it's just, there was just so many beautiful layers, so many gorgeous.
It sounds
layers.
really complex and
great.
Yeah,
great.
It was. And don't go onto the Goodreads commenters because it's like, why Maria has to be trans?
Never read the comments.
Like, just fuck off. Fuck off.
Just
if you want to read
Neve's recommendation.
Yes.
If you want to read more romances about two white cis people, you can go to basically most any other
I think
romance.
there's at least 5 books that you could read about that.
Yeah, and it's just really gorgeous. Also, like, if you're into like STEM, like, you could really enjoy that. That part of it I found a little bit harder to sort of engage with, but again, I really loved the characters, and so I was just
awesome.
I was really happy with them.
Sounds great.
Sounds like a great summary.
So
bit
great
of
to
science,
see.
Bit of romance.
Sciencey romance.
So great to see books, representing our community, spreading out through the different genres. I think that's really excellent.
Yeah, exactly. And it was just...
It's good to see yourself,
Yeah, exactly. And you've got some really nice... they're just so non-stereotypical as characters. They're really well fleshed out, and you can really, like... I didn't feel like they were tokenized.
Yeah.
Within the book. I felt like they were sort of fully embodied characters, which was really nice.
Can't really ask for anything more than that as a reader, I think.
The only thing I'm going to ask for more of is more romance recommendations from Neve, because that sounds so stellar.
Oh, I loved it. It was good. Okay, and my second recommendation is kind of a book, but more sort of a poet. I've kind of been obsessed with Ariel Cunningham's poetry for like a few years now. She came back to Australia for just recently. She has a new book that's called Black and Ropey, which is really gorgeous and I love. And previously she's published the Tarantus Soapbox, which is also really fabulous. Basically, I think it's really hard for me to describe her poetry because it's sort of, so much of it is her performing it, but it sort of deals with diaspora and being, mixed race and bisexual, and in those intersections of identity and culture. It's really gorgeous. I'm just going to talk about one poem in particular, which is, I think it's called Curls and Other Wars, but I'm not 100%. And it's basically like the metaphor of how her, like, she had in her early life, her father liked it when her hair was straight as opposed to like very curly, and how then that sort of lent into how she felt compelled to perform as straight as opposed to bisexual. And so it was just, oh god, the poem, it spoke to me on so many levels. It was gorgeous. And
is there a copy of it online maybe that we can put in the show notes?
I don't know if that particular, because it's one of her more recent poems, but other poems you can find her performing them online. Another really great poem of hers is about beat poets, which is basically like fuck big poets.
Okay, I'm gonna look that one up. Well, we'll find some videos of her performing and pop them in the show notes.
Yeah,
sounds great.
Yeah, she's really nice.
Where's she from?
America.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think Texan. Yes.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool Rex, Neve.
So there's my Rex.
All right, Fee. That's an amazing looking list. It looks like a it's a diagram.
Chart.
Yeah, it's like a flow chart. There's arrows and brackets and all sorts of exciting things. So
I think in arrows.
I'm excited. I look forward to this every month. What do you got?
I don't even know where to start, to be honest, because this, as I was saying to you both before we started recording, was like, well, I have one recommendation, but really they're all tied together because they're all tied together. Let me start with this one, and it's called "And the Weak Suffer What They Must." And it's got a question mark, so really I should be, and the weak suffer what they must. And it's by Yanis Varoufakis, and the subtitle is Europe, Austerity and the Threat to Global Stability. And it's a really fascinating book. It's all about how the euro was created and the European Union. But instead of just talking about the creation of it from the 90s, he goes right back to Bismarck and he talks about the German unification. So it's a really robust history of the economic structures of Europe, and it also goes into the impact of the gold standard and creating that post-war of how they created the economies and structures around that. Basically, the gold standard being all economies in the world were held up against gold bullion, and up until the 70s, the Americans held the gold standard where they could only buy a certain amount of gold to kind of keep everyone steady and even. And then Reagan was all like, fuck that, we're not doing that anymore. And then that kind of led to a lot of disarray globally and the swift financialization of America, which kind of leads me to two other books, because I find this whole area of global economics endlessly fascinaning, because I'm
sure you're really.
I don't
really
think Neve
into it.
does.
So Janice, I saw him on Q&A or something, and he was really.
Did he come to the Writers' Festival last year as well?
Yeah.
He's been at the Wheeler Centre a good few times.
Yeah, okay.
He's a great speaker.
Constantly in Australia. He's such a great speaker. If you ever get a chance to see Yanis speak, highly recommend, because he contextualized finance through he really puts the social and socio-economic, and it makes it a really fascinating read because he doesn't deny that history and humans exist. It's not just money. And I found that really interesting. That's why I really get on board with reading about economics, because I think it's structures that we need to understand to create change and good in the world, and we can't ignore that we all use money.
Yeah.
Basically, that kind of leads me into a writer that I truly love. He is a better storyteller than Giannis. Giannis, I think, is better in person than in print, and it's Michael L. Lewis, who he wrote The Big Short, which the film was made out of the book. And I have to say, read the book. The film is like a half-baked job of an excellent book about...
Well, that's pretty normal.
Well, yeah, like I got confused in the movie because I was like, wait, I've read the book and I understand the book, but what the fuck is this movie talking about? So confusing. There was like celebrity cameos in it for no reason. But if you're interested in global economics and the stock market and how it all relates, read The Big Short and The Boomerang. They're two books by Michael L. Lewis. But to get a true understanding of the 2008 global recession, how that happened, please read And the Weak Suffer What They Must, because that explains the history of global economics from the 1800s onwards in a really comprehensive but comprehensible way. And the kind of conversations that Europe are having at the moment in terms of austerity measures and budget cuts and the impact that that's having globally, I think is really prevalent and pressing, because the sort of cuts that they're making huge budget cuts, and it's causing things, widespread health issues.
Austerity doesn't work. Austerity measures never work.
They don't work at all, and it's really crippling all the health kind of structures that are in place.
And people die.
Yeah.
People are
That's
literally
the end
dying
result.
because
The end
of
result of austerity measures is people die.
Yeah.
That's just... Can't get much more simple than that, really.
Oh, absolutely. And oof, that gets me really riled up and angry on so many levels. But recommend, if you're even a glimmer of interest in this, read some of these books, because they really just pull the door open on a world that's often kept in glass towers away from people because it's too hard to comprehend. But often even the people working in the industries don't even know what their decisions mean and the historical context of their decisions.
Absolutely.
So I really always encourage people to read about economics, which is why I recommended 3 books about economics. And my next book that I'm recommending is called, kind of ties into it a little bit, because it's kind of the trouble of what really happened from 2008 is that a lot of stuff were put into algorithms that people don't actually understand how to use, and a lot of decisions were made using maths as being the gold standard, and it kind of really ties into the conversation that we were having earlier about maths is seen as objective when really it's humans who analyze the maths, and we are not objective.
We are not.
And the book that really covers this well is called Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill.
Oh, that's clever.
And it is a fascinating book at the impact of how maths and algorithms are affecting society on a very real level, and how it's not often critiqued and held up to the same standards, because often algorithms are created by private entities and corporations, and they're hidden through proprietary law.
Well, I mean, look at the algorithms that like Facebook and Twitter and all our social media platforms use.
Yeah.
Nobody gets to see them, and they're trash.
And they're also impacting who gets elected into office.
Well, we've seen that from the 2016 US election.
Absolutely. Yeah. So kind of our entire democracy, and I'm like using air quotes, is being affected by algorithms and maths. And this book explains it in a really simple, easy to understand way, which is always great when it's kind of a confronting, complex topic. So Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill. And it kind of ties me into another recommendation, because I found out about that book through a favourite podcast of mine called 99% Invisible with Roman Mars. And he does an episode with Cathy talking about how algorithms are applied to different facets of life, from, say, the American education system and the justice system. And that podcast in particular goes into a lot of detail about that in a really entertaining, interesting way. And I just would highly recommend that podcast in general. And the premise of that podcast is 99% invisible with good design. 99% of it is invisible to the naked eye, because that's what good design is. It's seamless, effortless, efficient, and generally aesthetically pleasing. And they do different topics each episode.
What's the episode that Cathy O'Neil is on?
I'll look up the number of that one and
We'll
put it in the show notes. But their most recent episode was such a romp. It was so fascinating. Into episode 280 is called Half Measures, and it looks at why America is one of only a handful of countries in the world that doesn't use a metric system.
Oh my God, why? What's wrong with them?
It is some of the
It's
best
infuriating.
podcast material I've
Okay, I'm gonna go
ever
listen to
read.
that.
And do you know what it comes back to? Religion. Like, they've literally tried to bring the metric system in countless times, but then somebody realized, wait a second, an inch, and they somehow related an inch being to God, and to a foot is roughly the size of a foot, and the length of an arm is roughly a yard, and like the body is inherently mathematical because we're all designed in the eye of God. So to get rid of a foot, a yard, and a gallon would be to defy God. So really, we can't use the metric system. It's such bizarre reasoning that it's mind-boggling and fascinating and just absolutely fantastic. And it's just such a brilliant podcast.
I was so going to listen to that episode.
Because I'm sure a whole lot of religious orders are just really gunning for, like, you know, no, you cannot bring in. Oh God!
The Pope is absolutely concerned about yards and inches and gallons.
And,
100%.
Fuck the metric system.
That's what,
Even though
godless heathens.
I just imagine there's some like facet of like there's some sort of like subculture in the American religion where they are
Flat
like
worlders.
fuck the metric system, but like we still like my dad still talks in feet. Like how many
in
of us?
height though.
Yeah, but no, but even sometimes when he's talking distances, like he doesn't use yards, but that's just like
It's about
he's
6
in,
furlongs.
he's in his 50s, so that was still kind of around in Australia. So, but he definitely uses the metric system as well. It's not like you have to, once you move into metric, that's it. Nobody's allowed to say foot or inch anymore. Like,
Yeah, it's rude. Like, well, I mean, like with netball, it's like the distance is 3 feet.
Yeah.
We talk about height and feet just because it's easier
Absolutely.
than centimeters.
Yeah.
But yes, it's just with science and with like learning, it's so much easier to use the
And when the
metric.
rest of the world is using the metric system, it just seems like
things could go awry. Well, yes, indeed. And this podcast goes into what goes awry, and it is hilarious.
Wow,
like the amount
okay.
of things where miscommunications happen because somebody's thinks they're talking in kilos and someone's talking in pounds. Hilarious.
okay,
Good.
I'm so pumped to listen to
And
that
just
episode.
like every episode they do, I listened to about 6 in a row yesterday, and I was like, oh, I need to spread these facts immediately because there are so many interesting facts about the world and what's invisible and what we see and perceive, and it's just really snappily put together.
Yeah, not to mention whenever someone says 100 degrees, I'm sort of like, ah! And then I'm like, oh, fuck, Fahrenheit.
Their temperatures are so like, oh yeah, it's really annoying.
Makes 0 sense.
It does make 0 sense.
And my last recommendation is a fantastic podcast brought out by the ABC, and it's called Tell Me Straight. It comes out every 2 or 3 days, and it's
2 or 3 days.
Yeah, they do it. They're full timers. Yeah, they're onto it.
Neve and I are like every 2 or 3 days.
The dream. And they basically answer relevant current questions. And it's an Australian podcast, so they do a lot of Australian focused things, but they also go globally, internationally, asking questions about current news events and contemporary issues. So they've done quite a bit on the plebiscite They've done a couple of episodes and they've broken it down, and they get experts in to explain what the High Court actually is, what decisions they can make, what do these decisions mean. But they've also done episodes of what's happening in Spain at the moment with the system of Catalonia and Catalan and the vote that's happening there and why it's void. And they even go into explaining what the GST is and why Western Australia wanted to concede the other week, saying, fuck you, Australia, we want to be our own country.
Yeah, go for it, guys.
They get experts in. They always have a great chat. I learned so much within 20 minutes, and it's actually a really kind of warm way of keeping up with the news. It's not sensationalized. It's not cold and clinical. It's a really fun news podcast that doesn't leave you feeling depressed or anxious.
That's always a plus.
It's such a plus. It's a ray of sunshine. I literally love the two of them, and I've been going back.
Who's hosting it?
I wish I knew their names. They're just like, I hear their voices and I'm like, butter to my ears. Tell me more.
Nice.
So I'll leave a link to that in the show notes so that people can then listen and find out their names and leave them little love letters.
That's really
questions.
Sweet.
Okay.
That's the best love letter. Just a series of questions of how does this world work? And maybe a little bit of economics in there as well.
And some physics.
Hot.
So sensible.
Okay, to me. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
You need to run through them. Let's go.
Okay, I've got two. I've only got two books this month. The first is Rubik by Elizabeth Tan. She's a West Australian author. Collection of short stories, but they're all kind of linked, but you kind of don't get that. You sort of realize that as you read. Ooh. Because characters kind of pop back up again and like things happen again, and so you just sort of like, as you're reading, you're slowly realizing that these stories are all linked. Not in super explicit and clear ways, but sometimes it's really subtle. But really, really wonderful. Just really great writing, and I think I devoured that book in like 2 days or something. Just like smashed it.
Sign of a good book.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic, great collection of short stories by a wonderful Australian writer. So also it's got a beautiful cover.
Yeah, I was actually like sitting on that comment. Gorgeous cover.
It's such a great front cover. And I know that's kind of a shallow thing to say, but you know, books have an inherent aesthetic.
Yeah, definitely.
I think, and book covers can really make or break. But it's a beautiful front cover, fantastic collection of short stories. She's really high on my must-read list now, so anything that comes out by Elizabeth Tan, I'm going to be chasing it down.
And she's got such a quirky style. Like, some of the stories where it's just like really kind of bizarre sci-fi, speculative fantasy. Yeah,
but not in a way that feels...
showy or
not in, you know, sometimes some sort of sci-fi stuff can be really like heavy going, you know, if you're not a sci-fi reader, it can really be like beating you over the head with that sort of stuff. Rubik is not like that at all. Like, it's there, but it's kind of almost, it's done in a literary way. So it's really, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Loved it. And I think it's going to be one of those collections that I'll go back and read again.
Oh, nice.
Because it feels like maybe you'll sort of like pick up more of the subtle sort of links and things with maybe a second read. I loved it. And the next one is a book that I probably maybe wouldn't normally have read, but I went to... the Ballarat Book Bonanza on last weekend, which is a fantastic event that happens every year, which is a big book sale of ex-library books. So from the Ballarat Library, but also local school libraries as well. It's basically heaven for me, is what it is. And so I picked this book up. It's called Illuminae by Amy Kaufman and Jay Christoph. And... oh my God, I loved it so much.
Yeah, you cut me off, actually. I was going to recommend this. I had to scramble for another recommendation.
I love this. This is like, it's so thick. It's massive. It's like...
you don't get intimidated.
It's like 2.5 inches thick or something, but it's not...
What's that in metric? Sorry.
But what's really interesting about it is it's all done... in like reports.
Yes,
and
transcripts
imagery
and yeah.
There's because it's really gorgeous. Because they're in space for a lot of this novel. The authors, like how it's set out looks like they're in space, and like words are put in, like used in a physical sense. Ugh, I can't, like they're scattered around the page.
Some of the pages, they're sort of like, you know, instead of having a page of text, you've got like a black page, which is space.
Yeah.
And then you've got these words that sort of like loop across the page in like shapes and different ways. And like it's like transcripts of conversation, like text-based conversations, you know, like messaging service conversations. And
oh yeah, definitely. And messaging service conversations in books can get really fucking annoying. If there are too many of them.
This was great.
But yeah, there's so much variation that you've just found yourself getting really pulled in to the narrative.
Loved it. I actually had
great.
a couple of 1 a.m., 2 a.m. reading sessions reading this
party.
because I just wanted to keep reading. I was just like so invested in this story and in these characters, Katie and Ezra.
Yeah.
Who are like 17-year-old couple, and they're living on this planet. I can't remember what the name of the planet is called. Anyway, it's like an illegal mining operation, and then this big corporation decides that they're going to attack them, and they get rescued onto these ships. But it's like one of the ships is like really bad. They're on two separate ships, and one of the ships is like really badly damaged, and they're like racing through space trying to get away from the bad guy, and the bad guy's following them, and the computer on the big ship is like losing its mind and doing lots of really bad things, and it's just it's that probably sounds terrible what I just said.
It sounds like Firefly.
But it's great. It's so great.
And it's also, you know what's really interesting is that it could be so flat, but like how it's every single bit of information builds into this suspenseful like climax, and it's actually almost awesome because you can sort of almost see like the narrative construct itself, or it's like a deconstructed, if you get what I mean, like because you can, as you're reading it, you can tell, you know why everything, you can tell why every single bit of this is in this spot.
Yeah, because it's like, you know, the whole structure of the book is like this group is preparing this report for biotech, which is the bad company. And then the report is, you know, like a series of bits and pieces, you know, that they've sort of put together, which, you know, when you think about it is perhaps not the best basis for a narrative, but it's so well done, and it's constructed so fantastically that it doesn't feel like there's any gaps or any holes. It just, I bloody loved it. And there's 2 more books, I think, in the series.
Yeah.
And I'm like, they're so high on my must read list now. Like
the next
need
one
to get
is
them.
already out. I don't think the third one is yet to be released.
Okay. I hope this is not like going to be a George R.R. Martin thing where it takes 15 years for the third one to come out, because I may not survive.
Well, I mean, I'm a little wary because, I mean, technically it's YA and it's a YA trilogy, and that's always a very precarious. That's such a precarious thing.
Well, look, I mean, I almost feel like this could be a it's part of a trilogy, but you could read it as a standalone.
Oh yeah, definitely. I could be very satisfied as a standalone, and I feel like that's of rare quality as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anyway, top marks for me from that one, and I'm really glad I picked it up at the Book Bonanza. And I'm really glad that it's on my bookshelf.
And they're Melbourne-based writers.
Yeah.
Actually, Jay is the first, what is it, the end of October? Jay is the first male writer that I've read this year.
Hey.
I haven't read anything by a male writer.
And it was a co-author collaboration.
Yeah,
didn't even get, not even by himself.
And also,
pretty proud of that.
Hashtag love us YA.
Yeah, for sure.
So, yeah, it's all good.
It is all good. Cool. Well, thanks for listening to Literary Canon Ball. We hope you'll tune in again next month when we'll be talking about the Pillow Book by, and I know I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, Say Shonigan. This book was published in the year 1002. I think that's correct. So pretty pumped. Excited to read a book that's, 1,000 years old.
Yeah.
Plus.
Why
Plus.
not?
Yeah. Why not?
Why stick to a couple of hundred? Go hard or go home.
Absolutely. I like your style, Neve.
And in the meantime, if you want to continue the chat or you just want to be digital friends, you can follow us on Twitter, and we talk about books and we put up articles, and there's a lot of great stuff happening on Twitter or on Instagram. Oh, the Twitter is at Lit Canon Ball, all one word. And on Instagram, we are at Literary Canon Ball. And you can find us on Facebook at Literary Canon Ball. And we do a lot of art, a lot of conversations, a lot of pictures, occasional gifts, boomerangs.
Lots of fun stuff.
And if you want to tell us something that's a little bit more than 140 characters, send us an email or a love letter, whatever, with some economic stuff in there. Do that. We love getting emails. And our email address is literarycannonball@gmail.com.
And make sure to check out our website, literarycannonball.com, where you'll find a full wrap of the show notes and a full list and links to our recommendations. That's literarycannonball.com.
And don't forget to subscribe at whatever podcast app you are using. Tell your friends all about Literary Canon Ball, and if you feel so inclined, please leave us a review on iTunes. We'll be forever grateful. Maybe we'll send you a love letter back.
With economics.
And some physics. And some book recommendations.
Yeah, I know it. Actually, I've got a pile here that I didn't get into.
Okay, that's a deal. If you leave us a review on iTunes, send us a message, tell us that you have, and we will send you back a love letter with some physics and some book recommendations, and it'll be great fun.
Yeah, that matters.
And there'll be some puns. There'll definitely be some puns. Awesome. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Wait a second. Let me get my books. No, that's like Maria. Maria, Maria, Maria. Don't use that.
I think you have to use that.